Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at the science of addiction
Okay.
and moving past that sort of like simple explanation of, oh, it's just a lack of willpower.
Right.
Um, and really trying to understand WHY, it's
Yeah.
classified as a disease.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. I think
Yeah.
a lot of people get that wrong.
Yeah, for sure.
Um,
So the article that we're looking at today, it's from Rolling Hills Recovery Center.
hmm
Have you heard of them?
I have, yeah. They specialize in addiction treatment, so I think they're a pretty good source for this.
Yeah, they seem to know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And the article is called Is Addiction a Disease? The Science Explained.
Pitchy.
Yeah. So basically, we're going to try and unpack this whole thing about how drugs can actually hijack the brain's reward system
hmm
and make them feel more rewarding
Right.
than natural pleasures. Like,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah, it's really interesting how that works.
So what are your initial thoughts when you hear that?
Well, I think it's important to remember that our brains are wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. That's kind of like a basic principle of survival, right?
Right.
And
Yes.
addiction really plays into that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So the article defines addiction, or what they call clinically substance use disorder, as a chronic illness
Oh, yeah.
that affects brain function and behavior.
Right. So it's not just a simple choice.
No, it's like an actual physical change in the brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that can lead to a lot of negative consequences.
Totally. I mean, we see it all the time, like people losing their jobs, relationships falling apart,
Yeah.
even legal troubles and financial strain.
Absolutely. It's a ripple effect.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
And I think it's important to remember that because it's chronic. It's not like you can just fix it overnight.
Right, it's an ongoing condition.
Yeah, it's like having a chronic illness like diabetes or something.
Right.
You have to manage it.
Okay, so let's talk about the brain's reward system
Okay.
and how drugs sort of exploit it.
Right. So when we experience pleasure, our brain releases dopamine.
Dopamine.
Yeah, it's a feel-good chemical.
Makes sense.
And it basically signals to the brain, hey, that was great, let's do it again.
Yeah.
And that's important for survival, right? It helps us learn and repeat behaviors that are important.
Like breathing.
Exactly, or eating or, things like that.
Okay, so where do drugs come into all of this?
Well, the problem is that drugs tap into this system and kind of hijack it.
Hijack it.
Yeah, they trigger a huge e-surge of dopamine,
Oh, wow.
way more than we would normally experience from natural things.
It's like way more than like having a delicious meal.
Yeah, or like you said, breathing fresh air.
Right.
Those things pale in comparison to the rush that you get from certain drugs.
Oh, wow. So it makes those everyday pleasures less pleasurable.
Exactly. And so the more you use the drug, the more your brain craves that intense dopamine hit.
And that's how the cycle of addiction starts.
Yeah, it's like the drugs are rewiring your brain to prioritize them above everything else.
Wow, that's kind of scary.
Yeah, it is. And to make things even more complicated, the brain starts linking memories and places, and even people with drug use. So these cues can become triggers.
So like you could be walking down the street and see a certain place and
Yeah.
suddenly get a craving.
Exactly, or hear a song, or smell a certain scent.
So it's like your brain is working against you.
In a way, yeah, it really highlights that addiction is not just a moral failing.
Okay.
It's a complex interaction between your brain chemistry and learned behaviors.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So let's move on to tolerance and dependence.
Okay.
These terms are often used interchangeably,
Right.
and I think it's important to understand the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So tolerance is basically your body getting used to the drug over time.
So you need more of it to get the same effect.
Right. Like, you know how people who drink a lot of coffee need more and more over time?
Yeah.
It's kind of like that.
Yeah.
And then dependence is when your body actually relies on the drug to function normally.
So if you don't have it, you experience withdrawal.
Exactly. And those symptoms can range from like mild discomfort to really serious and even life-threatening reactions.
Depending on the substance. So does that mean that tolerance and dependence always equal addiction?
That's a good question. And the answer is not necessarily.
Okay.
So, for example, someone who's prescribed opioids for chronic pain,
Mm-hmm.
they might develop a dependence on those opioids.
Because the body needs them to function.
Right. But that doesn't automatically mean they're addicted.
Right.
It's more about the compulsive seeking and using of the drug despite negative consequences.
It's loss of control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's really the hallmark of addiction.
So it's a lot more nuanced than just physical dependence.
Yeah, it's a combination of physical, psychological, and behavioral factors.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the underlying causes of addiction.
Right.
Is there like a single gene or something that makes people more susceptible?
I wish it were that simple,
Right.
but unfortunately it's much more complex than that.
Okay.
The Rolling Hills article talks about how there's no single cause.
But like a combination of factors.
Exactly.
Okay, so what kind of factors are we talking about?
Well, NED, the National Institute on Drug Abuse.
They outline 4 main reasons why people start using drugs in the first place.
Okay, I'm curious. What are there?
The first one is to feel good, which is kind of self-explanatory.
Right.
Seeking that pleasurable effect.
Yeah, makes sense.
But then there's to feel better,
To feel better.
which is more about self-medicating,
Oh.
using drugs to cope with anxiety or stress or depression.
So it's like seeking relief from difficult emotions.
Exactly. And it might work in the short term,
Right.
but in the long run, it can obviously lead to much bigger problems.
Yeah, for sure.
And then the third reason is actually to get ahead.
To get ahead.
Yeah, this is about using drugs to enhance performance.
So like athletes using steroids?
Exactly. Or students using stimulants to study longer.
Wow. I hadn't really thought about that one as much.
Yeah, it's not just about seeking pleasure or numbing pain.
Right.
It's about trying to achieve something.
To improve.
Yeah.
Okay, and what's the fourth reason?
The fourth reason is to fit in.
To fit in.
And this is especially relevant for young people. Oh yeah, peer pressure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wanting to belong to a group where drug use is common.
Makes sense, especially in those teenage years when everything is so, about social dynamics.
Absolutely. Fitting in is super important at that age.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that these 4 reasons are just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
There's a whole complex interplay of biological, environmental, and social factors that contribute to addiction.
So it's like a perfect storm of different things.
Yeah, pretty much.
So could you break down some of those factors for us?
Sure, let's start with the biological ones.
Okay.
So genetics play a role.
Like if your parents or grandparents struggled with addiction, you might be more likely to as well.
It's definitely possible, although it's not a guarantee.
Right.
And then there's developmental stage.
Okay.
A teenager who experiments with drugs is statistically more likely to become addicted.
Than someone who starts later in life.
Right, because the adolescent brain is still developing.
It's more vulnerable.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then we have environmental factors.
Okay.
So things like family dynamics can have a big impact.
So like a chaotic home environment.
Yeah, or lack of emotional support can increase the risk of addiction.
Wow. So it's not just about the individual, it's about the environment they're in.
Exactly. And of course, peer influence is a big one too.
Especially for teenagers.
Right. If your friends are using drugs, you're more likely to try them yourself.
And potentially become addicted.
Yeah. And even just access to drugs,
If they're readily available in your community.
Exactly. That can make a difference.
So it's like all these different things, the biological, the environmental, the social, they all kind of come together.
Yeah. It's a complex web of factors.
That makes it really hard to pinpoint one single cause.
Absolutely.
Wow. This is fascinating, but also a little overwhelming.
Yeah. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's important to understand.
Definitely.
So I think we should take a break here.
Okay.
And when we come back, we'll delve a little deeper into the treatment and recovery process.
Sounds good. And then there's the route of administration,
Yeah.
like how the drug gets into your body.
Okay.
That can actually impact how addictive it is.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so like injecting heroin, for example,
Mm-hmm.
that produces a much faster and more intense high.
Then snorting or swallowing it.
Right,
Oh, wow. So it's like a supercharged dose of dopamine hitting the brain all at once.
exactly. And that makes it much more addictive.
Wow. That makes sense.
Yeah, and the article also mentions hyperactivity as like a behavioral sign of drug use.
Okay.
Some people become super energetic and talkative.
Oh, wow.
They might even experience hallucinations.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so their behavior changes in a very noticeable way.
So it's not just about the physical effects. There are psychological and behavioral components, too.
Exactly, and that's what makes addiction so complex.
Right.
It's not just about willpower or making bad choices.
It's a disease.
It is, yeah, it's a disease that affects the brain.
And the good news is that it's treatable.
That's the most important thing to remember.
Okay, so let's talk about treatment then.
All right.
What's the first step for someone who needs help?
Well, the first step is often the hardest.
Which is...
Admitting that there's a problem.
Oh, yeah. Denial is a powerful thing.
It really is. Yeah, and it can be really difficult to admit that you need help.
Especially with the stigma surrounding addiction.
Exactly.
It's not easy.
It's not, but it's so important to have a support system.
Like friends and family.
Yeah, people who can encourage you to seek help.
So they can help you get past that denial.
Right, because sometimes it's like your brain is trying to protect itself from facing the truth.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So having loved ones who can gently guide you in the right direction is crucial.
Absolutely.
And once someone does reach out for help,
Mm-hmm.
Typically, a medical professional will conduct an assessment
Okay.
to determine the severity of the substance use disorder.
So they'll look at what substance is being used.
Right. How often it's being used, how long they've been using it,
Okay.
whether there are any co-occurring mental health conditions.
Oh, right, because those often go hand in hand.
Exactly. It's all connected.
So it's like a personalized diagnosis
Yeah, you could say that.
to figure out the best course of treatment.
Right. And those treatment plans can range from outpatient therapy to more intensive inpatient rehab programs.
Depending on the individual's needs.
Exactly.
So there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Nope. Everyone's different.
Okay, so what are some of the treatment options available?
Well, medication can be a really valuable tool,
Okay.
especially in managing cravings and withdrawal symptoms.
So it's not all about willpower.
No, not at all. Medication can actually help to rebalance the brain chemistry.
That's been disrupted by drug use.
Right.
Okay, so for example, with opioid addiction,
Mm-hmm.
there are medications like methadone and buprenorphine.
Exactly. Those can be really helpful.
Okay, and what about therapy?
Therapy is crucial.
Because it addresses those underlying psychological and emotional issues.
Exactly. Yeah, and there are different types of therapy that can be helpful. Well, one that's commonly used is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
I've heard of that.
It focuses on identifying and changing negative thought patterns and behaviors.
So it's like retraining your brain.
In a way, yeah, it's about giving you coping mechanisms and strategies to break free from those addictive cycles.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then there's also dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT.
What's that one about?
DBT focuses on building skills like mindfulness, emotional regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness.
Wow, those sound like really useful skills for anyone, really.
They are, yeah. It's about
Okay.
giving you the tools to manage cravings, deal with difficult emotions, and navigate relationships in a healthier way.
So it's not just about talking about the problem, it's about actually learning how to change your behavior.
Exactly.
And then beyond individual therapy, there are also group therapy options.
Yeah, and support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous and Smart Recovery.
I've heard of those.
Those can be really helpful for providing a sense of community.
Like you're not alone in this.
Exactly, and it's important to remember that treatment needs to be tailored to each individual.
Right.
What works for one person might not work for another.
Okay, so finding the right combination of tools and support is key.
Absolutely.
And it's important to stay in treatment for a sufficient amount of time.
Yeah, rushing the process can increase the risk of relapse.
So it's about building a strong foundation for
Uh,
lasting change.
Right, and remember that relapse is not a failure.
Oh.
It's a learning opportunity.
A chance to adjust the treatment plan.
Exactly, and with the right support and guidance, individuals can overcome those challenges and continue on their path to recovery.
That's really encouraging.
It is, yeah, recovery is possible.
Absolutely. And it's inspiring to hear about people who have overcome addiction and are now living healthy and fulfilling lives.
Definitely, their stories give hope to others who are struggling.
Yeah, and it reminds us that addiction is not a life sentence.
It's a treatable disease.
And with the right help and support.
People can recover.
Wow, this has been a really eye-opening conversation.
I agree.
I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's so much more to learn about addiction.
But my understanding of it has definitely shifted.
In what way?
Well, I used to think of it as like, a personal failing,
Right.
like a lack of willpower or something. But now I see it as a complex brain disease.
Exactly, and that's a really important distinction to make.
It is, and it makes me feel more hopeful.
How so?
Because if it's a disease, it means it's treatable.
Right. It's not something that people are just choosing to do.
Yeah, and that gives me hope for people who are struggling with addiction.
It should. Yeah, there is hope for recovery.
Absolutely, and it's amazing to think that we can actually use this knowledge about the brain's reward system to not only overcome addiction, but also to cultivate healthier habits in all areas of life.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea.
It is, right? Like instead of just focusing on what to avoid, we can actually use this understanding of how our brains work.
To promote positive behaviors.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
it's like hacking the system for good,
I like that.
right?
Yeah.
Instead of letting it work against us.
We can use it to our advantage.
Exactly. But how do we actually do that?
Well, one way is to create new reward pathways
Okay.
associated with healthy behaviors.
So give me an example.
Okay, so let's say you want to exercise regularly instead of viewing it as a chore,
Which I often do.
right? Focus on the positive feelings you get afterwards.
Like that endorphin rush.
Exactly, or the sense of accomplishment.
Okay, so it's about reframing our perspective
Hmm.
and really tuning in to those natural rewards.
Yeah, and you can even enhance those rewards by pairing your workout with something enjoyable.
Like listening to music.
Exactly, or a podcast.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Make it something you look forward to.
Okay, so it's like creating positive associations with the behavior
Right.
that make it more appealing.
Exactly.
Interesting. And what else can we do?
Well, another strategy is to break down large goals into smaller, more manageable steps.
Okay, that makes sense.
Because achieving those smaller milestones triggers dopamine.
So it reinforces the positive behavior.
Right. It's like giving yourself little rewards along the way.
Instead of getting overwhelmed by the big picture.
Exactly.
Okay. And I guess consistency is key too.
Absolutely. The more you repeat a healthy behavior, the stronger those neural pathways become.
So it becomes easier to stick with it.
Right. It becomes less about willpower and more about habit.
Like building a mental muscle.
I like that analogy.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess patience is important too.
But definitely, change takes time.
And there will be setbacks.
There will, but don't view them as failures.
Yeah.
They're just opportunities to learn and adjust your approach.
That's a good way to look at it.
It is, yeah.
Well, this has been such a fascinating conversation.
It has. I really enjoyed it.
Me too. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that addiction is not a sign of weakness.
It's a treatable disease.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And with the right knowledge, compassion and support, recovery is possible.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this journey today.
My pleasure.
And remember, knowledge is power. Understanding how our brains work can empower us to make positive changes and live healthier and more fulfilling lives.